The war had been going on for 300 years, and nobody could remember why it started anymore. The Calrith and the Vossen were killing each other across a dozen star systems, and every attempt to stop them had failed. Ships burned in the darkness of space every single day. Planets were bombarded until nothing lived on their surfaces. Children grew up knowing only hatred for an enemy they had never met. The Galactic Assembly had tried everything they could think of, and nothing worked. Elder Coordinator Thexel sat in his chair at the Assembly headquarters and looked at the latest casualty reports. Another 1 billion dead this month? Another 3 colonies destroyed. The numbers had stopped meaning anything to him years ago. They were just numbers now. He closed his eyes and wondered if this was how civilizations ended. Not with a bang, but with endless grinding violence that never stopped until everyone was dead. The other council members were arguing again about sanctions and peacekeeping forces and diplomatic missions. Thexel had heard it all before. They had sent their best diplomats to negotiate. The diplomats came back in body bags. They had sent peacekeeping fleets to enforce ceasefires. The peacekeepers got caught in the crossfire and had to retreat. They had tried economic sanctions, but both sides would rather starve than make peace. Nothing worked because neither side wanted peace anymore. They wanted victory or death, and they did not care which came first. Thexel raised one of his 3 hands, and the chamber fell silent. Everyone looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too many failures. He spoke slowly through his translation device, because what he was about to suggest was either brilliant or insane, and he was not sure which. He said they should ask the humans for help. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Humans were the newest members of the Galactic Assembly, and they were terrifying. Their planet Earth was classified as a death world, one of the most dangerous planets anyone had ever found. The gravity was crushing. The atmosphere was full of corrosive oxygen. The weather could kill you in minutes. Diseases evolved there that made scientists across the galaxy shudder. And the humans themselves were persistent predators who had climbed to the top of their food chain by simply refusing to give up on anything ever. Someone objected that humans were still in their cadet. Phaeazin had not even finished their basic training. Another council member pointed out that humans had no experience with conflicts this old or this complicated. A third reminded everyone that humans were dangerous and unpredictable and might make things worse. Thexil listened to all of it, and then said that was exactly why they should ask the humans. They had no history with this conflict. They had no old grudges or ancient hatreds. They would look at the problem with fresh eyes and maybe see something that everyone else had missed. The vote took 3 hours, and it was close, but desperation won in the end. The council agreed to send a message to Earth asking for volunteers. They would not explain the full scope of the mission until someone accepted. It was not entirely honest, but Thexel did not care anymore. He was willing to try anything, even if it meant lying to Deathworlders who could probably tear him apart with their bare hands. The message went out across the stars and arrived at the Interstellar Defense Academy in Colorado 2 weeks later. The academy was built into a mountain and housed cadets from Earth who wanted to serve in the galaxy's military forces. The message was posted on a bulletin board in the main hall, and most cadets walked past it without a second glance. It looked like a routine diplomatic mission. It's a kind of boring assignment that nobody wanted. But 5 cadets stopped to read it more carefully. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was a tactical specialist who spent most of his time studying battle formations and strategic theory. He was quiet and intense, and other cadets said he could read a battlefield like some people read books. Lieutenant Amy Chen was an engineer who had taken apart and rebuilt her first shuttle engine when she was 12 years old. She understood machines better than she understood people, and that was fine with her. Lieutenant Carlos Martinez was a linguistics expert who spoke 9 languages and could learn a new one in about 2 weeks. He smiled easily and made friends everywhere he went. Lieutenant Sophie Bennett was a medical officer with steady hands and nerves that nothing could shake. She had kept people alive through things that should have killed them. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper was a pilot who flew like the ship was part of his body. His instructor said he had instincts that bordered on supernatural. The 5 of them stood in front of the bulletin board and read the message about a special diplomatic mission to a conflict zone. It said the assembly needed observers who could provide a fresh perspective on a complicated situation. It said the mission would be dangerous, but important. It did not say anything about a 300-year war or billions of dead or two civilizations that had forgotten how to do anything except kill each other. Jake looked at the others and asked if anyone was interested. Amy said it sounded better than another 6 months of training simulations. Carlos said he was curious about what kind of conflict needed human observers. Sophie said people were probably dying and she could help with that. Ryan just shrugged and said he was bored and wanted to fly somewhere that mattered. They put their names on the volunteer list and went back to their classes. None of them knew what they were signing up for. None of them knew they were about to be dropped into the middle of the galaxy's longest and bloodiest war. None of them knew that the entire Galactic Assembly was counting on them to do what centuries of trained diplomats could not do. They were just 5 young humans who wanted to help. They were cadets who had barely finished their training. They were from a death world that most species avoided. And somehow, they were about to become the galaxy's last hope for peace. 2 days later, they received orders to report to the shuttle bay with full deployment gear. Their mission briefing would happen in transit. They packed their bags and said goodbye to their friends and boarded a transport ship that would take them to the war zone. The ship lifted off from Earth and climbed into the sky and left the blue planet behind. Jake watched through a viewport as Earth got smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among billions. He did not know it yet, but he would not see home again for a long time. None of them would. They were heading into something bigger and darker than anything they had trained for. But they were human, and humans did not quit. That was what they were good at. That was what made them dangerous. That was why the galaxy had called them. The transport ship took 2 weeks to reach the conflict zone, and during that time, the 5 cadets learned exactly what they had volunteered for. They sat in a briefing room that smelled like recycled air and stared at screens showing destruction on a scale they could barely comprehend. Entire planets reduced to lifeless rocks. Billions of casualties listed in neat columns of data. Fleet battles that had raged for years without a clear winner. This was not a conflict or a dispute or a disagreement. This was total war, and it had been going on for 300 years. Jake studied the tactical reports and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had trained for combat scenarios and diplomatic missions, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Calrith and Vosen were not fighting to gain territory or resources anymore. They were fighting because fighting was all they knew how to do. He looked at his team and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. They had been sent to observe and report, but observation was not going to stop this war. Amy pulled up ship, designed specifications and battle damage assessments. She was good with numbers and patterns, and she started seeing things that troubled her. The weapons both sides used were getting more destructive with each passing year. Energy weapons that could crack continents. Kinetic bombardments that left planets uninhabitable for centuries. Biological agents that killed every living thing they touched. Both sides were escalating toward weapons that would destroy everything, including themselves. She did the math twice to make sure she was right, and then she told Jake that if something did not change soon, there would be no one left to make peace with. Carlos spent his time studying the languages and cultural files. He was fascinated by how both civilizations had changed during the war. The Calrith had been artists and philosophers before the conflict started. Their crystal cities had been famous across the galaxy for their beauty. Now, they built nothing but weapons, factories, and military academies. The Vosen had been explorers and scientists who valued knowledge above everything. Now their universities taught only warfare, and their children learned to hate before they learned to read. The war had consumed both cultures completely and turned them into mirror images of each other. 2 civilizations that existed only to destroy their enemy. Sophie reviewed medical reports from both sides, and what she found made her want to cry. The casualties were not just soldiers. Civilians died by the millions in orbital bombardments and planetary sieges. Children were conscripted as soon as they were old enough to hold a weapon. Medical supplies were diverted to military use while civilians suffered and died from treatable diseases. Both sides had lost so much that the idea of losing more did not seem to matter anymore. He wondered how you made peace between people who had nothing left to lose. Ryan did not look at reports or study files. He stood at the viewport and watched the stars slide past and thought about what it would be like to fly through an active war zone. He had been in combat simulations before, but those were controlled environments with safety protocols and reset buttons. Out here, there would be no reset button. One mistake, and they would all die. He was not afraid exactly, but he was aware that they were 5 humans in a small ship, heading into a conflict that had killed billions. The odds were not good. Their ship dropped out of faster than light. Travel at the edge of the neutral zone, and suddenly the war became real. The viewport showed a debris field that stretched for millions of kilometers. Shattered hulls of warships drifted in the darkness like tombstones. Some of the wrecks were centuries old, and some were still burning from recent battles. Ryan took manual control of their ship, a small corvette called the Perseverance, and began threading through the debris. His hands moved across the controls with practiced ease, but his eyes were sharp and alert. One piece of debris in the wrong place could tear their hull open. Amy monitored the sensors and called out obstacles before Ryan could see them. Her fingers danced across multiple screens at once, tracking debris vectors and energy signatures and a dozen other variables. She had installed custom sensor packages before they left Earth, and now she was glad she had. The standard equipment would not have been enough out here. She picked up active combat signatures 3 light minutes ahead and told Jake that someone was fighting right now. Jake made the decision quickly. He told Ryan to take them closer, but to keep the stealth systems active. They were here to observe, and they could not observe from a distance. The Perseverance crept forward through the debris field, with all its active systems shut down. To anyone scanning the area, they would look like just another piece of wreckage drifting in the void. What they saw over the next 6 hours changed. Everything they thought they knew about the war. The Calrith fleet moved in perfect geometric formations, their crystal ships reflecting starlight as they maneuvered. Every movement was precise and calculated. Every shot was measured. They fought like mathematicians solving an equation. The Vossen fleet flowed through space like water, their organic ships adapting and changing shape as they moved. They fought with fluid grace and unpredictable tactics. Both sides were beautiful and terrible to watch. But something was wrong, and it took Jake an hour to figure out what it was. The 2 fleets were not communicating with each other at all. There were no demands for surrender. No threats or taunts. No tactical chatter on open channels. They fought in complete silence like 2 deaf armies that could not hear each other scream. He mentioned this to Carlos, and the linguistics expert pulled up communication logs going back years. What he found was shocking. The last direct communication between Calrith and Vossen forces had been 47 years ago. For nearly half a century, the 2 sides had been fighting without speaking a single word to each other. They identified targets and fired weapons and died in their ships, but they never talked. Carlos stared at the data and said something that made everyone stop what they were doing. He said they had not just stopped talking to each other. They had forgotten how Sophie pulled up more records and found that peace negotiations had failed decades ago, not because the terms were unacceptable, but because neither side could communicate effectively anymore. The Calrith language had evolved to remove concepts related to peace and compromise. The Vossen had developed cultural taboos against speaking directly to enemies. Both civilizations had changed so much during the war that they literally could not negotiate, even if they wanted to. Amy looked at the tactical display, showing 2 fleets destroying each other in silence, and said what everyone was thinking. They had not been sent here to observe a war. They had been sent here to fix something that was fundamentally broken. The Calrith and Vossen were not fighting because they wanted to. They were fighting because they had forgotten how to stop. Jake called his team together. In the small common area of the Perseverance, they floated in 0 gravity and looked at each other with tired eyes. He told them that the assembly wanted them to find a way to end this war, but you could not negotiate with people who would not talk, so they needed to make them talk. Somehow they needed to force two civilizations that had spent 50 years in silence to start communicating again. Ryan asked how they were supposed to do that. Amy asked if they even had the authority to try. Sophie asked what would happen if they failed. Carlos said nothing, but his expression showed he understood how impossible this was going to be. Jake looked at his team and saw doubt and fear and exhaustion. They were 5 cadets barely out of training. They had no diplomatic experience and no authority and no plan. But they were human, and humans had a reputation across the galaxy for being too stubborn to know when to quit. He smiled and told them they were going to do what humans did best. They were going to be incredibly annoying until someone paid attention. The team spent the next week moving through the war zone like ghosts. The Perseverance's stealth systems kept them invisible to both fleets, and Ryan piloted the small ship with a skill that made impossible maneuvers look easy. They observed battles and recorded communications and studied how both sides fought. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. This was not a war anymore. It was a ritual of mutual destruction that neither side knew how to stop. Jake watched a Calrith supply convoy get intercepted by Fusan raiders, and he noticed something strange. The Calrith ships did not try to escape or call for help. They just formed a defensive pattern and waited to die. The Vossen did not demand surrender or try to capture the supplies. They just destroyed everything and moved on. Both sides went through the motions of combat like actors performing a play they had memorized centuries ago. There was no strategy anymore, no tactics. Just violence following violence in an endless cycle. Amy analyzed the battle patterns and found they were completely predictable. The Calrith attacked on a regular schedule. The Vossen responded the same way every time. Fleet movements followed formulas that had not changed in decades. She built a computer model that could predict the next battle with 90% accuracy. She showed it to Jake and said this was not warfare. This was routine. Both sides were going through the motions without thinking about what they were doing or why. Carlos listened to intercepted communications and heard things that broke his heart. Calrith soldiers talking about how many more years they had to serve before they could retire. Vossen commanders filing reports about combat operations like clerks filling out paperwork. Nobody talked about victory anymore. Nobody even talked about the enemy as if they were real. The war had become background noise, something that just happened, like weather or gravity. It was always there and nobody questioned it. Sophie studied casualty reports and found patterns that made no sense from a military perspective. Both sides took losses they could easily avoid. Colony ships flew through known danger zones instead of taking safer routes. Supply lines were left deliberately vulnerable. Defensive positions were built in places that could not be defended. It was like both sides were trying to maximize their own suffering. She realized with horror that pain had become normal. Loss had become expected. They were not fighting to win anymore. They were fighting because not fighting was unthinkable. Ryan flew the Perseverance close to a Vossen medical station and watched them treat wounded soldiers. The doctors worked with mechanical efficiency, patching up bodies and sending them back to fight again. Nobody talked to the patients. Nobody offered comfort or hope. The wounded were processed like cargo and shipped out to die again. He watched a young Vossen soldier wake up from surgery and ask how many of his unit survived. The doctor did not answer. The soldier asked again, and the doctor just walked away. Ryan realized that even among their own people, they had stopped talking about things that mattered. The 5 humans met in the Perseverance's tiny common room and shared what they had learned. The picture that emerged was clear and terrible. The Calrith and Vossen had not just stopped talking to each other. They had stopped talking about the war at all. It had become something that existed but could not be discussed. Children were taught that the war was eternal. Soldiers were trained to fight without questioning why. Civilians accepted losses without mourning. Both civilizations had trapped themselves in a silence that went deeper than just refusing to communicate with the enemy. Jake laid out his plan, and everyone thought he was crazy. They were going to intercept communications from both sides and rebroadcast them to the enemy. Not military secrets or tactical intelligence. Just regular communications, status reports, supply requests, casualty notifications. The everyday reality of the war. He said they needed to make both sides see each other as real again. Make them hear the voices of the people they were killing. Force them to acknowledge that the enemy was not some abstract concept, but actual living beings who suffered and died. Amy said it would work technically, but they would need to deploy a network of relay satellites to make the broadcasts impossible to jam. She started designing microsatellite lights that could be deployed from the Perseverance. Each one would be small enough to hide among the debris, but powerful enough to relay signals across the entire war zone. She worked for 16 hours straight and produced a design that could work. It was elegant and simple and completely illegal. Under about 40 different assembly regulations, Carlos programmed the translation matrices that would convert Calrith communications into Vossen language and vice versa. He made sure the translations preserved emotional content and context. He did not want cold military reports. He wanted the fear and pain and exhaustion to come through clearly. He wanted both sides to hear not just words but feeling. It took him 3 days to get the programming right, and when he was done he felt like he had created something that might start a war or end one. Sophie prepared medical supplies and emergency protocols because she knew this plan could go very wrong very quickly. If either side figured out what the humans were doing, they might decide to eliminate the interference. 5 cadets and a small ship would not last long against a battle fleet. She made sure everyone had emergency evacuation procedures memorized. She packed medical kits that could handle trauma injuries. She did not talk about the odds of survival because everyone already knew. Ryan plotted vectors for deploying the satellites. He needed to place them in positions where they would be hidden by debris but still able to relay signals effectively. He worked out flight paths that would let them deploy the network without being detected by either fleet. The calculations were complex, and the margin for error was almost zero. One mistake, and they would drift into an active combat zone. He ran the simulations 20 times and found a route that might work. It required flying through a debris field during an active battle while deploying satellites with perfect timing. He looked at the numbers and decided not to tell anyone how difficult it is going to be. They launched the first satellite on a Tuesday. Amy had built 30 of them, and they were small enough to fit in Ryan's hand. He deployed it manually through an airlock while the Perseverance drifted near a cluster of destroyed ships. The satellite activated silently and began scanning for communications to intercept. Within an hour, it had logged over 500 transmissions from both sides. None of them were directed at the enemy. All of them were internal chatter about logistics and operations and routine. Military business. The first broadcast went out 12 hours later. A Calrith supply officer requesting medical supplies for a field hospital reached Vossen commanders who were planning an attack on that exact location. The message was simple and bureaucratic. They needed antibiotics and surgical equipment and plasma for transfusions. They had 200 wounded soldiers and more coming in every day. The supply officer sounded tired and frustrated and completely unaware that enemies were listening. The Vossen commanders heard it and did nothing. They did not respond or change their plans. But they did not jam the signal either. The attack happened on schedule, and the field hospital was destroyed. But something small had changed. One Vossen commander filed a report that mentioned hearing the supply request. He did not say why he mentioned it or what it meant. He just noted that it happened. The second satellite was deployed the next day, and then the third and fourth. Within a week, the entire network was active and broadcasting continuously. Calrith heard Vossen. Vossen heard Calrith. The messages were mundane and routine, but they were voices. Real voices of real people doing real jobs in the middle of a war. Supply officers and medical staff and maintenance crews, and all the thousands of people who kept military forces running. Not heroes or villains. Just people trying to survive. Jake monitored the responses and saw small changes. Attack patterns shifted slightly. Some targets were avoided without explanation. Casualties decreased by a fraction of a percent. It was not much, but it was something. The silence was being broken one transmission at a time, and nobody could stop it because nobody could find all the satellites. They were too small and too well hidden, and there were too many of them. The voices kept coming and both sides kept hearing them whether they wanted to or not. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the satellite network went active, and happened in a way nobody expected. A Calrith destroyer took damage during a routine engagement and lost propulsion. The ship drifted into neutral space with its engines dead and life support failing. The crew sent out a distress call that was picked up by the relay. Network and broadcast to everyone in range, including a Vossen medical frigate that was only 20 minutes away. Standard procedure for both sides was clear. The Vossen should either ignore the distress call or finish off the disabled ship. The Calrith crew should fight to the death rather than accept help from the enemy. That was how things had worked for 300 years. But something was different now. The Vossen medical frigate changed course toward the Calrith destroyer. The captain did not announce his intentions or ask for permission. He just altered course, and his crew followed orders without question. Jake was monitoring communications when it happened, and he could not believe what he was seeing. He called the rest of the team to the command deck, and they watched in silence as the Vossen ship approached the crippled Calrith destroyer. Both vessels were being watched by dozens of other ships from both fleets. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was so thick it felt like the space between the ships might shatter. The Calrith captain opened a direct communication channel to the Vossen frigate. It was the first time in 47 years that a Calrith officer had spoken directly to a Vossen. His voice came through the translation matrix, and it was rough with pain and confusion. He asked one word: why? That was all. Just why? Why would you help us? Why would you save us? Why would you do anything except watch us die? The Vossen captain's response was simple, and it changed everything. He said, "Because we heard you calling for help." His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if rescuing enemies was the most normal thing in the world. The Calrith captain did not respond for a long time. When he finally spoke again, he gave permission for the Vossen crew to board and assist with evacuations. His voice was shaking. Amy recorded the entire exchange and ran it through every analysis program she had. The language patterns showed something remarkable. Both captains were speaking formally and carefully, as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, but they were speaking. After decades of silence, they had found words to use with each other. She played the recording 3 times, and each time she heard something new in the pauses and hesitations. 2 people trying to remember how to talk to someone they had been taught to hate. Carlos studied the translations and noticed that both captains avoided using certain words. They did not say enemy or hostile or threat. They used neutral terms like ship and crew and personnel. It was like they were carefully stepping around the hatred that should have been there. He realized they were not just talking to each other. They were creating a new language that made talking possible. Every word was a negotiation between what they had been taught and what they were choosing to become. Sophie watched the rescue operation through the Perseverance's sensors and saw something that gave her hope. The Vossen medical teams treated the Calrith wounded with the same care they would give their own people. There was no hesitation or reluctance. They stabilized injuries and administered medications and moved patients to safety with professional efficiency. One Vossen medic spent 20 minutes keeping a Calrith soldier alive through sheer determination. When it was over and the soldier was stable, the medic just moved on to the next patient. No drama, no speeches, just healing. Ryan kept the Perseverance at a safe distance, but his eyes never left the tactical display. He was waiting for someone to fire the first shot that would turn this rescue into another battle. Hardliners on both sides had to be watching. Commanders who believed the war should never end. Soldiers who had lost everything and wanted revenge. Any one of them could decide that this moment of peace was weakness that needed to be punished. His hands hovered over the controls, ready to run if things went bad, but no shots were fired. The rescue was completed in tense silence, and the Calrith crew was evacuated to the Vossen medical frigate. The damaged destroyer was left drifting in neutral space. The Vossen ship departed and returned to its fleet. The Calrith survivors were later transferred to a neutral assembly station where Calrith ships picked them up. The entire operation took 6 hours, and not a single weapon was fired by anyone. News of the rescue spread through both fleets, faster than light-speed communications could carry it. Soldiers talked in mess halls, and officers discussed it in briefing rooms, and civilians heard about it on both homeworlds. The official response from both governments was silence, but the unofficial response was confusion. People did not know what to make of it. Some called it weakness. Others called it courage. Most people just did not know what to call it because they had no words for enemies helping each other. The relay network kept broadcasting, and now something had changed. People were listening differently. A Calrith soldier intercepted a Vosin supply request and wondered if those supplies were going to the medical frigate that had saved his friends. A Vosin officer heard a Calrith casualty report and recognized the ship designation as the destroyer that had been rescued. The voices coming through the network were not abstract anymore. They were connected to something real that had happened. More messages started coming through that were different from the routine military chatter. Someone on the Calrith side sent a message asking if it was true that Vasan children were being conscripted at age 12. Someone on the Vasan side asked if Calrith civilians were really starving in the occupied territories. These were not military questions. They were human questions, or as human as aliens could ask. They wanted to know if the enemy suffered the same way they did. Jake realized what was happening, and it made him nervous and hopeful at the same time. The war was not over, but something fundamental had shifted. Both sides were starting to see each other as real, not friends or allies, but real living beings who felt pain and fear and hope. The silence that had lasted for decades was cracking, and nobody knew what would come through the cracks. The Assembly's Council of Mediators contacted the Perseverance with a priority message. Elder Coordinator Thexil appeared on their view screen, looking older and more tired than before. He asked Jake what they had done. His voice was filled with disbelief and something that might have been hope. Jake told him they had just given both sides their voices back. The rest was up to the Calrith and Vosin, but the rest was not going to be easy, and everyone knew it. Extremists on both sides viewed the rescue as betrayal. Hardline factions wanted the Vosin captain executed for treason. Calrith military leadership was divided between those who saw the rescue as weakness and those who saw it as something new and fragile that needed protection. The voices calling for peace were quiet and uncertain. The voices calling for war were loud and angry. The cadets found themselves protecting not just the relay network, but the very idea that talking was possible. When Calrith radicals tried to destroy one of the satellites, Ryan flew the Perseverance directly into their firing line. The small ship's shields held just long enough for Assembly peacekeepers to arrive and stop the attack. When Vasin militants tried to hack the communication, Network Amy's security protocols locked them out and traced their location back to a hidden base Sophie treated wounded from both sides when fighting broke out between moderates and extremists. She set up a small medical station on the Perseverance, and anyone who needed help was welcome. Calrith and Vasin wounded lay side by side in her makeshift hospital, and some of them talked to each other. Quiet conversations about home and family and what they would do when the war ended. If the war ended, nobody was sure anymore, but for the first time in 300 years, people were wondering if peace might be possible. Carlos spent his time refining the translations and adding context to help both sides understand each other better. He included cultural notes and historical references and explanations of idioms that did not translate well. He was building bridges between two languages that had grown apart during centuries of silence. Every word he translated was a small act of hope that communication could lead to understanding. The 5 humans were exhausted and scared and wondering if they had made things better or worse. The war had not stopped. People were still dying. But now both sides knew they were killing real people instead of abstract enemies. Whether that knowledge would stop the killing or make it worse remained to be seen. It took another month of careful work before formal peace talks were scheduled. The Assembly wanted to host the negotiations on station Harmony, where they had failed so many times before, but Jake suggested something different. He said they should meet on the Perseverance. The ship was tiny and cramped and barely large enough for its crew of 5. Adding diplomats from both sides would make it uncomfortable to the point of being ridiculous. But that was exactly why it would work. You could not maintain dignity and distance when you were squeezed into a room. It's barely big enough to turn around in. The Calrith delegation arrived first. 3 diplomats led by Ambassador Thren, who was a military commander before he became a negotiator. His crystalline body reflected the ship's lights and patterns that Carlos had learned meant caution and suspicion. The Vassan delegation came an hour later. For representatives, including a young diplomat named Vel, who had never seen combat but had lost family to the war, the Perseverance's common room became a conference chamber, and everyone had to float in zero gravity because there was not enough room to sit properly. Jake welcomed both delegations and laid out simple ground rules. Everyone would speak in turn. Carlos would translate. Anyone could call for a break at any time. There would be no recording of the talks and no media present. What happened in this room would stay in this room unless everyone agreed otherwise. Both sides accepted the terms because they had no choice. The alternative was to keep fighting until one side or both were extinct. The first day was a disaster. Ambassador Thren began by listing 300 years of grievances, starting with the original territorial dispute that nobody even remembered correctly anymore. He spoke for 2 hours without stopping. When he finished, Vel responded by recounting every Vosan colony that had been destroyed and every civilian who had died. She spoke for 90 minutes, and her voice shook with rage. By the end of the day, both sides had said nothing except, "We hate you for what you have done." Sophie brought food and water, checked on everyone's physical condition. The stress was taking a toll on both delegations. Ambassador Thren's crystalline structure showed fracture lines from tension. Vel had developed a tremor in her hands. The other diplomats looked exhausted and defeated. Sophie told Jake privately that if this continued, someone was going to collapse. He nodded and said they just needed to get through the hate before they could find anything else. The second day started the same way. More lists of crimes and atrocities, more anger and pain, but something changed in the afternoon. One of the Calrith diplomats named Soren said something that was not on the official talking points. He said he was tired. It's just that. He said he had been fighting this war for 40 years, and he was tired, and he wanted it to stop. The room went quiet. Vel looked at him and said she was tired too. She said her entire generation had known nothing but war, and she did not want her children to inherit the same burden. Carlos translated their words exactly as spoken, including the weariness and hope. He did not clean up the language or make it diplomatic. He let the exhaustion come through, because that was real. That was what both sides were feeling, even if they had not been able to say it before. Jake saw the moment when something shifted in the room. The diplomats stopped reading from prepared statements and started talking like people who were in pain. The breakthrough came on the 15th day, when they had almost given up. The talks had stalled on the question of war crimes tribunals. The Calrith wanted Vosan commanders prosecuted. The Vosan wanted the same for Calrith leaders. Nobody would compromise, because compromise felt like betrayal of the dead. They were going in circles, and everyone knew it. Vel spoke out of turn and violated every rule of diplomatic protocol. She said something that froze everyone in place. She said she did not remember why the war started. She knew the history because she had been taught it in school, but she did not live it. None of her generation had. They were fighting because their parents fought, and their parents fought because their parents fought. She asked when it would end, and her voice broke on the question. Ambassador, Thren started to give the traditional answer about fighting until victory or death. Then he stopped. His crystalline features flickered with patterns that Carlos recognized as confusion. Thren said he did not really remember either. He knew the official history, but it felt like something that had happened to other people. He had been born during the war, and raised during the war, and trained to fight during the war. Fighting was all he knew, but he could not honestly say he remembered why it mattered anymore. A Vosan diplomat named Kesh said something that made everyone look at him. He said they were fighting because fighting was what they did. It was not about territory or resources, or even revenge anymore. It was just what happened. Every day the fleets launched and fought, and some people died, and everyone went home and did it again the next day. It had become routine, like breathing. Nobody questioned it, because questioning it was unthinkable. Jake let the silence stretch out. Nobody spoke for 10 minutes. Then Amy brought up a holographic display showing casualty statistics. She showed them the numbers in a way that made them impossible to ignore. 300 years of death. Billions of lives ended. Entire generations that existed only to die in combat. Planets that would take millennia to recover. The numbers kept scrolling, and nobody could look away. Sophie added medical data showing long-term effects of the war. Genetic damage from radiation exposure. Psychological trauma across entire populations. Children born with stress hormones so high they could not function normally. Both civilizations were being damaged in ways that would last for centuries, even if the war ended tomorrow. She said they were not just killing each other. They were killing their own futures. Ryan brought up navigation data showing fleet movements over the past 50 years. The patterns were completely predictable. Every battle happened on schedule. Every response was automated. He said this was not warfare anymore. This was just mutual suicide in slow motion. Both sides were following programming that nobody had bothered to change in decades. Carlos showed them. Linguistic data demonstrating how both languages had changed during the war. Words for peace had been removed. Concepts of compromise had become literally unspeakable. Children growing up now could not even imagine a world without war because their language did not have words to describe it. He said they were not just fighting each other. They were destroying their ability to ever stop fighting. The 5 humans did not offer solutions or push for specific compromises. They just showed both sides what the war had done to them. The Calrith and Vossen diplomats looked at the data and saw themselves reflected in ways had been carefully avoiding for 300 years. They saw that the war had consumed everything they were, left nothing behind except the machinery of death. Vel asked a question that nobody had asked in living memory. She asked what they would do if the war ended. What would Vossen society become if it was not built around fighting the Calrith? What would their children do with their lives? What would they build instead of weapons? The questions hung in the air like strange objects that nobody knew how to handle. Ambassador. Thren answered slowly and carefully. He said he did not know. The Calrith had been at war so long that he could not imagine peace. But he was starting to think that maybe not knowing was better than the certainty of endless death. Maybe they could figure it out together. They stopped killing each other long enough to think. The peace agreement took another month to negotiate. There were territories to divide and reparations to discuss and war criminals to prosecute. The details were complicated and painful, and everyone had to compromise on things that felt sacred. But they kept talking. When negotiations got heated, Sophie would call a break and make everyone eat something. When translations became difficult, Carlos would work with both sides to find words that expressed what they meant. When someone needed space, Ryan would take them on a short flight around the Perseverance just to clear their heads. When technical problems came up, Amy would fix them. When everything seemed impossible, Jake would remind them that impossible things happened every day. The ceasefire was announced on Cycle 300. In one of the Calrith-Vassoon conflict, both governments agreed to stop fighting immediately. It was not a permanent peace yet, but it was a beginning. The actual peace treaty would take years to finalize. The healing would take generations. But the war was over. The silence had been broken. People were talking instead of shooting, and that made everything else possible. The 5 human cadets returned to Earth 3 months after the ceasefire began. The assembly offered them medals and promotions and positions in the diplomatic corps. They declined politely. They were soldiers, not politicians. They had done what needed doing, and now they wanted to go home. The Perseverance was decommissioned and preserved as a museum. The tiny common room where peace had been negotiated became a shrine to the idea that talking was always better than fighting. Jake stood at a press conference and told reporters that the humans had not ended the war. The Calrith and Vasen ended it themselves. The humans just helped them remember they could talk to each other. The galaxy had forgotten that enemies could become something else if you gave them a chance. The 5 cadets had reminded everyone of something simple and important. Words were stronger than weapons if you were brave enough to use them.